The Festival of the Moon happened once a generation, and Fenry Duskthorn had spent her entire life learning how to be invisible during it. It wasn't difficult, really. Being an Omega in a pack that measured worth by strength, by strong bonds, by perfect bloodlines, taught a person to take up the smallest possible space from an early age. Fenry had perfected the art of staying at the edges of any hall, of smiling politely without ever drawing attention, of vanishing into the shadows at the exact moment eyes began scanning the crowd looking for someone to mock. "You're doing that thing again," said old Mary Beth, the village healer, seated beside her at the edge of the main hall, watching the final preparations for the ceremony. "That thing where you try to turn into a wall." "It's a useful skill," Fenry murmured, adjusting the plain shawl over her shoulders, painfully aware of how the patched fabric clashed with the ornate gowns filling the rest of the hall. "Especially on a night when everyone's going to be competing for the Alpha King's attention. You shouldn't have to hide in your own pack." "I'm not exactly of the pack, Mary Beth. I'm the Omega nobody wanted, remember? The one the Bond rejected at 19, in front of half the territory." Fenry kept her voice light, the tone she'd used for 3 years to talk about the worst night of her life without letting how much it still hurt show through. "People prefer that I remember my place." Mary Beth pressed her lips together, something old and sad crossing her weathered face. But she didn't argue, because there was no arguing with a truth everyone in that hall knew far too well. The hall itself thrummed with anticipation. Silver lanterns hung from the ceiling, mimicking the very light of the full moon shining outside, and at the center of it all, standing on a dais raised specifically for the occasion, was Alpha King Draven Ashcroft Vale. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair falling loose past his collar beneath a ceremonial cloak, and eyes of such intense gold they seemed to absorb every bit of light in the hall simply by existing. Fenry had known that face from a distance for years, not out of vanity, but because it was impossible not to, in a pack small enough that the king himself occasionally appeared at local ceremonies. They'd never exchanged more than a formal greeting, the distant kind a king offers any subject without truly seeing them. And yet, there was a pull she'd never quite managed to explain. Subtle, almost imperceptible, every time they were in the same room. Like an invisible cord stretched between their two chests, humming softly whenever he passed close enough. She'd learned long ago to ignore it. Probably just imagination. Or the foolish longing of a lonely Omega projecting meaning where none existed. "She's here," Mary Beth whispered, and Fenry followed the healer's gaze to the hall's entrance, where a woman glided in as though she'd been born specifically for this moment. Sylvain Ravensworth was, by any reasonable measure, breathtaking. Honey-colored hair arranged in perfect curls, a dark green silk gown that seemed sculpted specifically for her body, and the kind of calm confidence that only ever came from a lifetime of being told, repeatedly, that she was destined for great things. Beside her walked her father, Lorcan Ravensworth, a lean man with calculating eyes, who Fenry had always found vaguely uncomfortable to be near, though she'd never quite managed to explain why. "She's going to be chosen tonight," someone whispered nearby, with the absolute certainty of someone who already knew the evening's script by heart. "Everyone knows it. Her father's been building toward this since she was born." Fenry's chest tightened, not quite jealousy, she'd tell herself later, but a shapeless, vague sadness, the kind that came from watching someone else receive, with such ease, everything life seemed to have categorically decided Fenry would never have. The ceremony began shortly after, the presiding elder leading the ancient rituals with the weary solemnity of someone who'd performed them far too many times to count. Draven stood at the center of the dais, posture impeccable, expression carefully neutral, the kind of face Fenry recognized from a distance as performing composure, rather than actually feeling it. "The ritual of choosing," the elder intoned, his voice echoing through the hushed hall, "has existed since the first kings of this line. Beneath the full light of the moon, the Alpha will recognize the one his heart and his pack have chosen to reign beside him. Fenry watched, a strange lump in her throat, as Draven stepped down from the dais and walked directly toward where Sylvain waited, the entire hall holding its breath collectively. But 3 steps away from her, something happened that no one, not even Draven himself, judging by the sudden tension in his face, seemed to expect. He stopped, his golden eyes, fixed with determination on Sylvain only a moment before, wavered, sliding briefly across the hall as if searching for something, someone, he couldn't name. For an impossibly long moment, the Alpha King stood frozen in the middle of the hall, his entire body drawn tight as a bowstring, his eyes sweeping the crowd with a growing, visibly involuntary urgency. That familiar pull in Fenry's chest sharpened into something acute and unmistakable. And despite everything, despite years of training herself to be invisible, her whole body reacted, a shiver running down her spine, her breath catching in her throat. Draven's golden eyes found hers across the crowded hall. And everything, for one impossible instant, seemed to stop entirely. He took a step toward her before he even seemed to decide to, a single involuntary step, which sent the entire hall into instant confused murmuring. Fenry watched the exact moment he seemed to register his own body moving against his own intentions, watched the visible struggle cross his normally controlled face, watched him force his eyes back to Sylvain with an almost physical effort. "Sylvain Ravensworth," he said, his voice a little rougher than it should have been, a little less steady. "I choose you." The hall erupted into applause and cheers, but Fenry could barely hear any of it over her own hammering heart, over the confusing, inexplicable ache that had settled into her chest like an open wound. Beside her, Mary Beth had gone strangely rigid, her eyes fixed not on Draven or Sylvain, but on Lorcan Ravensworth, whose face had settled into an expression of pure, calculated relief. "Did you see that?" Fenry whispered, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. For a second there "I saw it," Mary Beth said, her voice strangely tight. "We're leaving, child. Now." "Mary Beth, what?" "Now, Fenry." The urgency in the old healer's voice was unmistakable, and before Fenry could question further, Mary Beth was already pulling her by the arm toward the hall's side exit, away from the crowd still noisily celebrating the choosing. They'd nearly reached the door when a different sound cut through the cheers and applause. A howl, deep and urgent, coming from somewhere near the dais, followed immediately by alarmed shouting and the sound of tearing fabric. Fenry turned just in time to see something impossible. Where the Alpha King had been standing seconds before, there was now only an enormous silver-furred wolf, its golden eyes still visibly, unmistakably human in their intelligence, its whole body tense and quivering with an urgency that made no sense for a man who'd just publicly chosen his mate in front of his entire kingdom. The hall descended into chaos. Guards shouting, nobles scrambling backward, Sylvain standing frozen at the center of it all with an expression of dawning, furious understanding that she quickly smoothed into something more composed. But the wolf paid none of them any attention. His head swung across the crowded hall, nostrils flaring, and then his eyes locked onto Fenry with a focus so absolute it stole the breath from her lungs. "Run," Mary Beth breathed, but it was already too late. The wolf moved. He crossed the hall in 3 powerful strides, guards scrambling uselessly to intercept him, courtiers shrieking and diving out of his path, and came to a stop directly in front of Fenry, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his enormous body, close enough to see her own stunned reflection in those achingly familiar golden eyes. The entire hall had gone utterly, deathly silent. Fenry stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide, to disappear the way she'd trained herself to disappear her whole life. But something else, something deeper and far more inexplicable, kept her rooted exactly where she stood, staring into eyes that seemed to be pleading with her, apologizing to her, recognizing her, all at once. Behind her, she heard Lorcan Ravensworth's voice cut through the silence, sharp with barely restrained panic. "Someone restrain that animal. He's clearly diseased or cursed or—" "He's not diseased," came a new voice, low and disbelieving, from somewhere in the crowd. "God's above. Look at his eyes. That's a bonding response. That's a true mate recognition." The murmur that swept through the hall at those words was immediate and electric. Hundreds of eyes swinging from the massive silver wolf to the plain, patched shawl Omega he stood trembling before, and Fenry felt the weight of every single one of those stares land on her like physical blows, old humiliation and fresh terror tangling together in her chest until she could barely breathe. Sylvain's composed mask cracked, just slightly. Fury flashing raw and unguarded across her beautiful face before she caught herself. And beside her, Lorcan Ravensworth's expression had shifted entirely. The earlier relief replaced by something colder, sharper, calculating in a way that made the hair on the back of Fenry's neck rise with instinctive alarm. The wolf that had, moments before, been the most powerful king in the territory whined low in his throat, pressing his massive head gently, almost desperately, against Fenry's trembling hand. And Fenry, standing frozen in the wreckage of a ceremony that had just publicly, catastrophically unraveled in front of the entire kingdom, understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that whatever strange pull she'd felt for years, whatever inexplicable connection she'd trained herself to dismiss as foolish imagination, had just been proven, beyond any possibility of denial, devastatingly real. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity, though it could only have been a handful of seconds before the hall erupted into full, unrestrained chaos. "Get back!" one of the royal guard shouted, moving toward the massive wolf with a spear lowered, though his hands were visibly shaking. "Get away from him, girl, before he—" "Don't!" Mary Beth snapped, stepping forward with surprising authority for a woman of her age, placing herself between the guard and the trembling pair at the center of the hall. "You'll do more harm trying to separate a true bond by force than you can possibly imagine. Look at him. He's not attacking. He's terrified." And he was, Fenry realized, still frozen in place, still feeling the wolf's massive head pressed against her hand, like he was afraid she might vanish if he pulled away. Beneath the raw power radiating off him, beneath the sheer size and strength that made every other creature in the hall instinctively give him space, there was something else entirely. A deep, visible tremor running through his enormous body, the same confused, desperate energy she'd seen in his eyes moments before he'd shifted. "Draven," she whispered, barely audibly, testing the name like it might mean something different now than it had an hour ago. The wolf's ears swiveled toward her voice instantly, a low, aching whine escaping him, and something in Fenry's chest cracked open at the sound. Sympathy, confusion, and something else entirely. Something warm and terrifying that she didn't have a name for yet. "This is an outrage," Lorcan Ravensworth's voice cut through the chaos, cold and sharp despite his earlier composed relief having entirely evaporated. "The king has clearly been cursed, or poisoned, or manipulated by some dark magic. I demand the council investigate this Omega immediately for witchcraft." The accusation landed like a blow, and Fenry felt old, familiar humiliation rise hot in her throat, even amid the surrounding chaos. The specific, practiced sting of being publicly blamed for something she didn't understand, didn't ask for, and certainly hadn't caused. "That's absurd," Mary Beth said sharply, rounding on Lorcan with an intensity that made several nearby nobles take an involuntary step back. "This girl has done nothing but stand exactly where she was standing. If anyone should be questioned, Lorcan Ravensworth, it's you, given how remarkably calm you seemed the moment your daughter was chosen, right before the truth apparently proved otherwise." Something flickered across Lorcan's face, quick, controlled, but unmistakable to Fenry's practiced eye for reading the subtle signs of someone hiding something. Fear, she realized. Not confusion. Fear. Before the accusation could develop further, the massive silver wolf let out a sound that silenced the entire hall instantly. Not a growl, not a threat, but something closer to a mournful, exhausted howl, low and vibrating with an emotion so raw it made Fenry's eyes sting with unexpected tears. And then, in front of the entire stunned assembly, his form began to shift. Fur receded, bones reshaped themselves with visible, painful effort, and within moments, Draven Ashcroft Vale knelt on the marble floor of his own great hall. Human once more, breathing hard, dark hair disheveled, golden eyes still fixed unwaveringly on Fenry with an expression of dawning, horrified realization. "Draven," Sylvain said, her voice tight with barely contained fury, stepping forward with her chin lifted in practiced composure. "You need to explain yourself. Immediately." He didn't look at her. He didn't seem capable of looking anywhere except at Fenry, his chest heaving, his hands visibly trembling where they braced against the marble floor. "I don't understand," he said, voice raw, seemingly to no one in particular, though his eyes never left her face. "I chose you. I said the words. I meant to say them. And then—" He shook his head, as though trying to physically dislodge some incomprehensible confusion. "My wolf has never once acted against my will. Not in 30 years. Not once." "Perhaps," came a new voice, calm and measured, cutting through the tension, "because your will was never entirely your own choice to begin with." Every head in the hall turned toward the speaker, an elderly man in deep blue robes, standing near the back of the crowd, leaning heavily on a carved wooden staff, his cloudy eyes carrying the particular unfocused quality of someone who saw considerably more than the physical world in front of him. "Corvinus?" Marybeth breathed, something like recognition and dread mingling in her voice. "You know him?" Fenry whispered. "Everyone in the healing circles knows him," Marybeth murmured back. "Or knew him, rather. He disappeared from public practice nearly 20 years ago. A visionary healer. The genuine kind. The kind who actually sees things, not the kind who simply claims to." The old man made his way slowly through the parting crowd, his staff tapping a steady rhythm against the marble floor, until he stood at the center of the hall, between the kneeling king and the trembling Omega, his cloudy eyes moving between them with an expression of deep, weary sorrow. 20 years ago, he said, his voice carrying easily despite its age-worn roughness. "I had a vision, a true bond, marked by moonlight and old magic, between an Alpha King not yet born to his crown and an Omega not yet born at all." His gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, toward Lorcan Ravensworth, whose face had gone the color of old ash. "I told this to a young man desperate for his family's fortunes to rise. I told him the bond would form between his future king and a child of humble birth, marked by a particular constellation of stars at her naming. I told him this in confidence, as a healer shares visions meant to guide, not to be weaponized." The hall had gone utterly silent, every eye now fixed on Lorcan, whose composure had entirely crumbled into something desperate and cornered. "That's a lie," Lorcan said, though his voice cracked on the words. "An old man's ramblings, nothing more. I told him," Corvinus continued, ignoring the interruption entirely, "that the child of that bond would grow to be an Omega undervalued by her own pack, rejected and dismissed precisely because true bonds of that particular old magic often present as unusually quiet, unusually deep, easily mistaken for weakness by those who don't understand what they're witnessing." His cloudy eyes found Fenry's face, something gentle and apologetic in his ancient expression. "I am sorry, child. I never intended my vision to become a weapon used against you before you'd even drawn your first breath." Fenry felt the ground seem to tilt beneath her feet, her mind racing to catch up with implications too enormous to fully grasp all at once. "What are you saying? That my rejection? That everything that happened 3 years ago?" was orchestrated, Corvinus said gently. I believe so, though I cannot know every detail. I only know I shared a vision in confidence, and that vision seems to have been used over the following decades to systematically ensure that when the true bond finally revealed itself, at this very ceremony, it would already have a rival prepared and positioned to claim the throne instead. All eyes turned, as one, toward Sylvain, who stood frozen at the center of the hall, her carefully composed mask finally, completely shattering into something raw and furious. Father, she said, voice shaking. What is he talking about? Lorcan's eyes darted between his daughter and the assembled crowd, calculation warring visibly with panic on his sharp features. Sylvain, I only ever wanted what was best for you. Everything I did. What did you do? She demanded, her voice rising, years of careful confidence cracking into something far more vulnerable and afraid. I raised you to be his queen, Lorcan said, desperation bleeding into his voice now. From the moment Corvinus shared his vision, I knew there would be a rival. Some undeserving nobody the fates had chosen instead of the daughter I'd raised to actually deserve it. I made certain you received the finest education, the finest training, every advantage a future queen could possibly need. I made certain the king's own advisors, subtly, over years, encouraged the match between you two. I ensured the girl marked by the vision remained isolated, dismissed, unremarkable. So unremarkable that even should the bond eventually surface, it would arrive too late, overshadowed entirely by everything you'd already built together. You mean, Sylvain said, horror dawning slow and complete across her face. You spent my entire life grooming me to steal someone else's fate. I spent your entire life ensuring you'd have the throne you deserved, Lorcan snapped, some of his earlier desperation curdling into anger. Do you have any idea what our family sacrificed, what I sacrificed, to position you for this moment? I wasn't going to let some rejected Omega's accident of birth cost you everything I'd built. Fenry, still kneeling numbly beside Draven amid the wreckage of a ceremony that had just revealed itself to be built on 20 years of manipulation, felt something complicated rise in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but some tangled combination of both, layered over the dizzying vertigo of learning that the entire trajectory of her life, the humiliation, the rejection, the years of careful invisibility had all been quietly engineered by a man who'd never once met her. Draven, still kneeling beside her, had gone utterly rigid, his golden eyes fixed on Lorcan with an expression of dawning, devastating comprehension. You've been advising my counsel for 15 years, he said, voice low and dangerous. You had access to my education, my upbringing, He stopped, jaw clenching hard enough that Fenry could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. You shaped how I was raised to think about worth, about strength, about what kind of mate a king should choose. I ensured you'd be raised to value what actually mattered, Lorcan said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely, panic now plainly visible beneath the crumbling bravado. Strength, composure, the kind of partner who could actually stand beside a throne, rather than some... Careful, Mary Beth said sharply, stepping protectively closer to Fenry's side. How you finish that sentence, Lorcan Ravensworth, unless you'd like the entire hall to hear exactly what kind of man spends decades manipulating a king's upbringing and a young girl's entire life simply to secure his own family's ambitions. The hall had descended into a low, roiling murmur of shock and outrage, courtiers and guards alike exchanging horrified glances as the full scope of the deception settled over the assembled crowd. Sylvain stood apart from everyone now, her father's confession seeming to have hollowed something out of her entirely, her earlier fury giving way to a kind of stunned, grief-stricken betrayal that made Fenry, despite everything, feel an unexpected flicker of sympathy. Draven turned back to Fenry then, his golden eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch all over again. Decades of manufactured circumstance suddenly stripped away between them, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth his wolf had recognized the instant she'd walked into that hall. "I don't know you," he said quietly, wonderingly. "And somehow my entire being has apparently known you my whole life." Fenry's throat tightened. 3 years of careful invisibility, of swallowed humiliation, of quietly convincing herself the strange pull she felt was nothing more than foolish imagination, suddenly crashing against this single, overwhelming moment of being seen, truly, completely seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted, voice barely steady. "Everything I thought I understood about my own life just changed in the space of one ceremony." "Then we'll figure it out together," Draven said, something fierce and certain settling into his voice despite the chaos still churning around them. "Starting with removing every advisor this man has ever placed near my council, and ending with whatever comes after that, for both of us." Behind them, Lorcan Ravensworth was being led away by a pair of royal guards. Still protesting his intentions had only ever been noble, while Sylvain remained standing alone at the center of the shattered ceremony, staring at the wreckage of a life built on a lie she'd never known she was living. And Fenry, kneeling on the marble floor of a king's great hall, felt the old familiar ache of rejection begin, for the first time in 3 long years, to loosen its grip on her chest, replaced by something far more uncertain, far more terrifying, and far more full of possibility than anything she'd allowed herself to hope for in longer than she could remember. The morning after the ceremony arrived with a headache, Fenry suspected had less to do with lack of sleep and more to do with the sheer absurdity of her new circumstances. "I keep waiting to wake up," she told Mary Beth, sitting stiffly on the edge of an enormous 4-poster bed in a guest chamber, more luxurious than anything she'd ever set foot in, let alone slept in. "Any moment now, I'll open my eyes and be back in my own bed, and none of this will have happened." "I'm afraid it happened," Mary Beth said, settling into a chair near the window, with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd spent the entire previous evening being treated for the first time in years, like the respected healer she actually was. "Though I confess I never expected to spend my old age witnessing a king shift into a wolf in the middle of his own choosing ceremony. Life does enjoy its surprises. That's one word for it." A knock sounded at the door, hesitant in a way that seemed entirely at odds with the commanding presence Fenry had witnessed the night before, and when she called for entry, Draven stepped inside, looking considerably more human and considerably less composed than he had on his throne. Dark hair still slightly disheveled, shadows beneath his golden eyes suggesting he'd slept about as well as she had. "I wanted to check on you," he said, hovering awkwardly near the doorway like a man who wasn't entirely certain of his welcome. "After everything last night, I imagine it was considerably more than you expected from a simple festival." "Considerably more, yes," Fenry agreed, and found herself, despite everything, fighting a small smile at his obvious discomfort. "Though discovering my entire life was secretly orchestrated by a scheming nobleman ranks fairly high on my list of unexpected Tuesday developments." Some of the tension in his shoulders eased, a ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You're taking this remarkably well." "I'm taking this by refusing to fully process it until I've had considerably more tea. It's a very sophisticated coping strategy. I developed it myself." Draven laughed, a short surprise sound, like it had escaped before he'd fully decided to allow it. And Mary Beth, watching the exchange with the sharp attention of a woman who'd clearly appointed herself unofficial chaperone, made a small, satisfied noise that both of them chose to ignore. "I've called an emergency council session for this afternoon," Draven said, sobering slightly. "Lorcan Ravensworth's manipulations run considerably deeper than one ceremony, it seems. My own advisors are still untangling exactly how far his influence reached." He hesitated, vulnerability crossing his face. "I wanted you to know before any of that begins. None of it changes what my wolf recognized last night. Whatever Lorcan orchestrated, Whatever twisted path led us to that hall, the bond itself is real. I felt it the moment you walked in. I've felt it, I think, every single time we've been in the same room over the years without ever understanding what it was. Fenry's breath caught, old caution warring with the hope blooming in her chest. I felt it too, she admitted quietly. I told myself it was nothing. Foolish imagination, an Omega convincing herself she mattered to someone who barely knew she existed. You mattered, Draven said, quiet and certain. You've always mattered. I simply didn't know it yet. The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile, until Mary Beth cleared her throat pointedly from her chair by the window. As riveting as this is, Your Majesty, I believe you mentioned a council session. Perhaps the two of you could continue this particular conversation once the kingdom's affairs are somewhat less chaotic. Draven flushed slightly, the first genuinely unguarded expression Fenry had seen from him since they'd met. Right. Yes. The council. He straightened, composure sliding visibly back into place, though warmth lingered in his eyes as he looked at her one last time before turning to go. I'll send word once we understand the full scope of what Lorcan built. In the meantime, you're safe here, Fenry. Whatever else happens, I promise you that much. Once he'd gone, Mary Beth turned to Fenry with an expression that managed to be both fond and deeply amused. Well, that was considerably more charming than I expected from a man who spent last night as a wolf attacking his own engagement ceremony. He didn't attack anything. He shifted uncontrollably in front of his entire court and abandoned his intended bride mid-ceremony. I'd call that attacking, in the loosest possible sense. You're enjoying this? Immensely, Mary Beth admitted, settling back in her chair with the satisfied air of a woman who'd waited a very long time to see Fenry happy. I've watched you disappear into corners for 3 years, child. Forgive an old woman for taking some pleasure in watching you finally be seen. The emergency council session, as it turned out, revealed considerably more than anyone had anticipated. Lorcan Ravensworth, held under guard pending formal judgment, proved remarkably willing to talk once the full weight of his exposure settled over him. Whether from genuine remorse or simple self-preservation, Fenry couldn't say, though Mary Beth, who attended the session in her capacity as a respected healer, relayed the details afterward with grim thoroughness. He's been manipulating the council for 15 years, Mary Beth reported, finding Fenry in the castle gardens that evening, where she'd retreated to escape the overwhelming strangeness of castle life for a few quiet moments. Small things, mostly. Steering conversations, placing certain advisors in certain positions, ensuring the king's education emphasized precisely the qualities he wanted valued in a future queen: poise, political calculation, the kind of composed strength that would make Sylvain seem like an obvious, natural choice when the time came. And me? Ensured you remained isolated, mostly through quieter means. A word here, a rumor there. Nothing so obvious it would raise suspicion. Just enough consistent pressure to keep you exactly where he needed you. Visible enough that the bond couldn't be entirely hidden should it ever surface, but dismissed enough that no one would think to question it. Fenry absorbed this in silence, watching moonlight ripple across a small garden fountain, trying to reconcile 3 years of quiet, persistent humiliation with the unsettling knowledge that some of it, at least, hadn't been organic cruelty but calculated design. I don't know how to feel about any of this, she admitted finally. Angry, I think. Mostly angry, but also strangely relieved, which feels wrong somehow. Why wrong? Because if some of my rejection was engineered, doesn't that mean some of it wasn't? That people genuinely looked at me and decided, all on their own, without any manipulation at all, that I wasn't worth valuing? Mary Beth settled onto the bench beside her, her expression softening. Child, I think you're asking the wrong question entirely. It doesn't matter how much of it was engineered and how much was simple cruelty. Either way, None of it was ever a true reflection of your worth. Lorcan Ravensworth didn't create your value or lack of it. He simply exploited people's willingness to believe convenient lies about someone quiet and undervalued, because that's always been easier than actually looking closely enough to see the truth. Fenry's throat tightened, tears pricking at her eyes. I've spent 3 years believing I simply wasn't enough, that the bond broke because something was genuinely wrong with me. And now you know differently, Mary Beth said gently. That's not nothing, even if it complicates the anger you're allowed to feel. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the garden fountain's steady trickle the only sound, until footsteps on the gravel path announced Draven's approach, looking considerably more exhausted than he had that morning, though lightness had settled into his expression despite the fatigue. The council's reached a decision regarding Lorcan, he said, settling onto the bench's opposite end at Mary Beth's gestured invitation. Formal exile, stripped of all titles and lands, effective immediately. It's more lenient than treason charges would typically warrant, but given the complexity of proving direct harm versus simple manipulation, the council felt it was the most defensible judgment. And Sylvain? Fenry asked. Complication crossed Draven's face. She's requested to speak with you directly, actually. Tomorrow, if you're willing. I understand if you'd rather not. Fenry considered this, surprised by her own lack of hesitation. I'll speak with her. None of this was her fault any more than it was mine. She's got her own reckoning to work through. That's remarkably generous given everything. I know what it's like to have your entire life shaped by forces outside your control, Fenry said quietly. Seems unfair to hold that against her, even if I'm still working out how I feel about the rest of it. Draven studied her for a long moment, unmistakable fondness in his gaze. You're nothing like what I expected, he said finally. I don't mean that as an insult. I spent years being told, subtly, persistently, exactly what kind of partner I should want. Composed, calculating, politically shrewd above all else. I never once considered that what I actually needed was someone capable of this kind of grace under circumstances that would have broken most people. Fenry felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to this kind of direct admiration. I'm not particularly graceful. I mostly just didn't know what else to do except keep breathing and hope the ground would stop shifting beneath me eventually. That's grace, Draven said simply. Perhaps the most important kind there is. The moment stretched between them again, warm and charged, until Mary Beth, apparently having decided she'd played chaperone long enough for one evening, rose from the bench with a small, knowing smile. I believe I'll leave you two to continue this conversation, she said. Try not to cause any further ceremonial chaos in my absence. Once she'd gone, easy silence settled between them, the garden fountain's gentle trickle and the distant sound of castle life continuing around them, somehow making the quiet feel more intimate rather than less. Can I ask you something? Fenry said finally. Anything. What happens now? Between us, I mean. I don't fully understand how any of this works. Bonds and fates and whatever your wolf apparently decided the moment I walked into that hall? Draven was quiet for a moment, considering the question with obvious care. Honestly, I don't entirely know either. I know the bond is real. I know my wolf has never once been wrong about anything in 30 years of instinct, guiding me through decisions my conscious mind sometimes struggled with. But I also know you deserve considerably more than simply being told fate decided for you, without any say in the matter yourself. Meaning? Meaning, Draven said, sincerity in his voice. I'd like the chance to actually know you, Fenry Duskthorn, not as a fated bond, not as whatever prophecy Corvinus once shared decades ago. Just as yourself, I'd like to earn whatever comes next, rather than simply assume it because some old magic decided it for both of us, before either of us had any choice in the matter. Warmth and hope unfurled in Fenry's chest, 3 years of careful invisibility beginning to give way to something she hadn't dared hope for in longer than she could remember. I'd like that too, she said softly. Getting to know you, I mean. Properly, without wolves or ceremonies or scheming noblemen complicating things. I make no promises regarding future scheming noblemen, Draven said, a real smile finally breaking through his earlier exhaustion. But I can promise to try considerably harder at the wolf and ceremony portions. Fenry laughed, the sound surprising her with its ease, and found Draven watching her with such open warmth that her own careful walls, built over years of quiet rejection, felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, worth the risk of finally, cautiously, beginning to come down. The meeting with Sylvain took place in a small, private sitting room the following afternoon, and Fenry spent the walk there rehearsing at least a dozen different opening lines, none of which felt remotely adequate to the strangeness of the conversation ahead. Sylvain was already seated when Fenry arrived, hands folded tightly in her lap, the confident poise Fenry remembered from the ceremony entirely absent. Without the elaborate styling and the practiced composure, she looked younger than Fenry had realized, and considerably more fragile. "Thank you for coming," Sylvain said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I wasn't certain you would." "I wasn't certain either, honestly." Fenry settled into the chair across from her, unsure how to arrange her own hands, her own expression, in the face of a woman whose entire life had just been revealed to be built on the same foundation of manipulation that had shaped her own. "I want to say I'm sorry," Sylvain began, her voice tight, "though I understand that means very little, given everything." "Did you know?" Fenry asked, the question she'd been turning over since the previous night finally finding voice. "About your father's plans. About the vision. Any of it." "No." The word came out fierce, almost desperate. "I swear to you, I had no idea. I grew up believing I was simply talented. Deserving. My father always told me I was destined for greatness, and I believed him, because what child doesn't want to believe their parents' praise is earned rather than engineered?" Her composure cracked, raw emotion bleeding through. "I spent my entire life training, studying, perfecting every possible skill a queen might need, genuinely believing I was earning my place beside Draven through merit. Finding out it was all orchestrated from before I was even born." She shook her head, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know who I am anymore, if none of it was actually mine to earn." Fenry felt understanding shift in her chest. Not quite sympathy, not yet, but the beginning of it. "For what it's worth," she said slowly, "I don't think your father's manipulation erases the actual work you did. The studying, the training, that was still you doing it, even if the reasons behind the opportunity were engineered. That has to count for something." Sylvain looked up, surprise evident on her face. "You're being remarkably kind, considering my father spent your entire life ensuring you'd be humiliated and dismissed, so I could take what should have been yours." "I'm angry," Fenry admitted. "Genuinely, deeply angry. About 3 years of feeling worthless because of choices I never made and never knew were being made around me. But that anger belongs to your father, Sylvain. Not to you. You didn't choose this any more than I did." Something in Sylvain's carefully held composure finally broke, a single tear spilling free before she caught herself, wiping it away with visible embarrassment. "I don't understand how you can be this generous. I would have been your queen. I would have stood beside him for the rest of both our lives, and you would have remained exactly where my father intended you to stay. Invisible, forgotten, believing yourself unworthy for reasons that were never actually true." "Probably," Fenry agreed, "but that's not what happened. And I've decided, somewhere in the last day of my entire life turning upside down, that I'd rather spend my energy figuring out what comes next than dwelling on what almost was." They sat in silence for a moment, the space between them slowly losing some of its earlier tension. "What will you do now?" Fenry asked eventually. "With your father exiled, I mean." Sylvain's expression turned uncertain. "I don't know. I've spent my entire life being groomed for one specific purpose. I'm not certain who I am without it." A small, humorless laugh escaped her. "It seems we're both rather adrift in our own ways." "Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing," Fenry said, surprising herself with the thought even as she spoke it. "I spent 3 years believing my worth was fixed, permanently, by one rejection. Maybe you get to spend the next few figuring out your worth without your father's plans attached to it at all. That sounds terrifying, but possibly also rather freeing." Sylvain's expression shifted, cautious, uncertain, but genuine. "I think I'd like that. Or I'd like to try, at least." She hesitated, then added quieter, "I truly am sorry, Fenry. For whatever comfort that offers, however small." "It offers some," Fenry said honestly. "Thank you for saying it." She found Draven in the castle's training yard later that evening, going through sword forms alone in the fading light, with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested he was working through something considerably more complicated than muscle memory. "You're going to exhaust yourself," she called out, settling onto a low wall to watch. He lowered his sword, breathing hard, sweat darkening his shirt despite the cool evening air. "Probably. It's a useful distraction from council sessions that have consisted almost entirely of untangling 15 years of manipulation from every corner of my kingdom's governance." "Bad day?" "Long day." He crossed to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him from his exertion. "We've found at least 6 advisors Lorcan placed or influenced over the years. Trade policies quietly shifted to benefit his family's holdings. Council appointments steered toward people who'd support whatever direction he wanted the kingdom to move. It's rather disturbing, honestly, discovering how much of what I believed were my own independent decisions were, in fact, carefully guided toward conclusions he'd already decided on my behalf." "That sounds exhausting in an entirely different way than sword practice." "It is." He glanced at her sideways. "How was your meeting with Sylvain?" "Strange, sad, mostly." She didn't know either, it turns out. Spent her whole life believing her opportunities were earned rather than engineered. "Do you believe her?" Fenry considered the question seriously. "I do, actually. She seemed genuinely devastated, not performing it. And honestly, even if some part of her suspected something, she was as much a pawn in her father's scheme as I was, in different ways. It's difficult to hold real anger toward someone who was raised, from birth, specifically to be used." Draven was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the sunset color the training yard gold. "You continue to surprise me, you know. Most people, discovering they'd been deliberately harmed for someone else's benefit, wouldn't extend quite this much grace to the person who benefited from that harm." "I've had a lot of practice being generous with people who didn't deserve it," Fenry said, dry humor entering her voice. "Turns out that particular skill transfers well to situations involving actual villains, rather than just ordinary unkind people." Draven laughed, the sound easy and genuine, and Fenry felt warmth settle in her chest at having caused it. "I find myself more and more grateful my wolf recognized you that night. Whatever manipulation led us there. I don't think I would have found my way to you otherwise. Not with 15 years of careful conditioning steering me elsewhere." "That's a rather unsettling thought," Fenry admitted, "that we might never have met at all, if not for a wolf's instinct overriding whatever plan had been laid for you." "Unsettling," Draven agreed, "but also somehow rather beautiful, that whatever Lorcan built, whatever careful architecture of manipulation surrounded both our entire lives, something more fundamental than his scheming refused to be overridden." They sat together as the last light faded from the training yard, comfortable silence stretching between them in a way that felt, Fenry realized with quiet wonder, entirely unlike the anxious, careful silence she'd maintained around most people for the past 3 years. This silence felt like rest, rather than hiding. "Can I ask you something else?" she said eventually. Always. What was it like? Growing up? Being groomed to want someone specific without knowing it? Does it feel different now, knowing? Draven considered this carefully, his expression thoughtful in the dimming light. It's strange, he admitted. Looking back, I can see it now. The subtle conversations, the careful praise directed at certain qualities whenever Sylvain was mentioned. The way certain advisors always seemed to steer discussions of my eventual marriage toward political advantage rather than genuine connection. At the time, it simply felt like good counsel. Reasonable expectations for a king's duty. He shook his head slightly. It's unsettling, realizing how easily my own judgment could be shaped without my awareness. I don't know if that makes me weak or simply human. Human, Fenry said firmly. Manipulation that's subtle, sustained over 15 years, by someone specifically positioned to influence you. That's not weakness. That's simply what happens when someone spends over a decade deliberately exploiting trust. I appreciate you saying that, Draven said quietly, though I confess some part of me still wonders how much of what I believe I want is genuinely my own, after everything. Then we'll figure that out together too, Fenry said, echoing his own words from the garden the night before. Slowly, without assuming the bond decides everything for us. Draven reached over, hesitant, and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing a slow, careful circle against her knuckles. I'd like that very much, he said softly. Getting to know you, and getting to know myself again, free of whatever careful architecture Lorcan built around both our lives. Fenry looked down at their joined hands, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with fate or bonds or ancient prophecies, and everything to do with the simple comfort of being chosen, genuinely, deliberately chosen, by someone finally free to make that choice entirely his own. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Fenry never could have predicted for herself a month earlier. Mornings spent in quiet conversation with Draven over breakfast, afternoons learning the overwhelming intricacies of court life from a patient, occasionally exasperated Mary Beth, and evenings that had, somehow, become her favorite part of each day, spent walking the castle gardens as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing at all. You're doing that thing again, Draven observed one evening, watching her carefully as they walked. The thing where you seem surprised every time someone treats you as though your opinion matters. Old habits, Fenry said, a little sheepishly. 3 years of being invisible doesn't unlearn itself in a month, apparently. No, he agreed, gentleness in his voice. I imagine it doesn't, though I intend to keep proving the habit wrong for as long as it takes. They'd fallen into an easy companionship over the past weeks, careful and unhurried, both of them clearly determined to build something genuine rather than simply defaulting to whatever the bond might have decided for them. Fenry found herself, more and more, looking forward to these evening walks with an eagerness that both delighted and faintly terrified her. The councils finally finished untangling Lorcan's influence, Draven said, as they settled onto a stone bench overlooking the garden's central fountain. 6 advisors removed, several trade agreements renegotiated, and a rather uncomfortable audit of the last 15 years of royal decision-making that revealed considerably more manipulation than I'd like to admit. That sounds exhausting. It has been, though there's been one unexpected benefit. He glanced at her, warmth in his expression. Removing his influence has meant reconsidering quite a lot of policy that never sat entirely right with me, even before I understood why, including several regulations regarding Omega rights within the pacts that I now suspect were quietly shaped to keep exactly the kind of dismissal you experienced systemically enforced. Fenry's chest tightened. You think that was deliberate too? I think, Draven said carefully, Lorcan understood that if Omega voices were consistently diminished across the kingdom, it would be considerably easier to ensure one specific Omega remained overlooked without anyone questioning why. I can't prove it entirely, but the pattern is difficult to ignore, once you know to look for it. That's... Fenry trailed off, the full scope of it settling over her slowly. That's so much bigger than just me. It is, Draven agreed. Which is partly why I've asked the Council to begin a full review of pack governance structures regarding Omega treatment, starting with representation in local leadership councils. It's slow work, and it won't undo 3 years of what you experienced, or however many others experienced similar dismissal without ever understanding why. But it's a start. Fenry stared at him, warmth and overwhelmed emotion rising in her throat. You're doing that because of me. I'm doing that because it's right, Draven corrected gently. You simply helped me see clearly what I should have questioned long before Lorcan's manipulation ever came to light. It was nearly 2 months after the ceremony when Bartran Wickery arrived at court, unannounced and travel-worn, requesting an urgent audience that set the entire castle buzzing with speculation. He's the elder from my home pack, Fenry said, watching the commotion from a castle window with a knot of unease forming in her stomach. I haven't seen him since I left. Why would he come all this way? The answer arrived that evening, when Draven found her in the library, his expression carefully neutral in the way she'd learned meant he was working through something complicated. Elder Wickery has brought troubling news, he said, settling across from her. It seems your original rejection 3 years ago wasn't entirely organic either. Fenry's stomach dropped. What do you mean? The pack member who rejected the bond, the one everyone believed was your true mate before he claimed your connection was weak, has apparently confessed, under considerable guilt after learning of recent events, that he was paid handsomely by an anonymous benefactor to publicly reject you and claim the bond was insufficient. The words landed like a physical blow. Fenry sat frozen, 3 years of carefully constructed understanding about her own worth crumbling entirely beneath this new revelation. Lorcan. Almost certainly, Draven confirmed, his voice gentle but grave. It seems his manipulation began even earlier than we realized. Not content to simply position Sylvain advantageously, he apparently orchestrated your public humiliation directly, ensuring the trauma would keep you isolated and dismissed long before the choosing ceremony ever arrived. Fenry felt tears rise, hot and sudden. 3 years of private grief and self-doubt suddenly revealed to have been, from the very beginning, a deliberate weapon wielded against her by a man who'd never once met her. I spent 3 years believing something was fundamentally wrong with me, she said, voice breaking. I told myself I wasn't enough, that the bond recognized some flaw I couldn't see in myself. There was never anything wrong with you, Draven said fiercely, moving to kneel in front of her, taking both her hands in his. Nothing. You were the target of a calculated cruelty designed specifically to break something in you that Lorcan understood, correctly, would otherwise have grown strong enough to challenge his plans. Why does that make it worse instead of better? Fenry asked, tears spilling freely now. Knowing it wasn't real, wasn't organic, somehow that hurts more, not less. Because it means you carried unearned grief for 3 years. Believing a lie deliberately constructed to hurt you, Draven said softly. That's allowed to hurt Fenry. Discovering a wound was inflicted deliberately doesn't make the wound any less real. She let him pull her into an embrace, her tears soaking into his shirt as 3 years of carefully buried grief finally found permission to surface fully, no longer softened by any lingering belief that some part of her rejection had been deserved. I want him to answer for it, she said eventually, once the worst of it had passed, her voice raw but steadier. Not just the choosing ceremony. Everything. Every year he stole from me believing I wasn't enough. He will, Draven promised. The council's already drafting formal charges beyond the exile. Fraud, manipulation of pack governance, deliberate psychological harm inflicted on a subject of the crown. It won't undo 3 years, but it will ensure he answers fully for what he's done. The formal trial, when it finally convened weeks later, proved to be one of the most difficult experiences of Fenry's life. Testifying before the full council, recounting the specific cruelty of that long-ago rejection, watching Lorcan's face remain carefully composed, even as the full weight of his manipulation was laid bare before the kingdom. But it was Sylvain's testimony, unexpected and unrequested, that ultimately shifted the proceedings most significantly. My father taught me from childhood that worth was something to be engineered rather than earned, she said, standing before the council with a composure Fenry recognized now as hard-won rather than natural. I believed for 23 years that I deserved my opportunities because I was simply better suited for them. I understand now that belief was built entirely on someone else's suffering, deliberately orchestrated to elevate me at their expense. She looked toward her father, fierceness in her expression. I request the council consider the full scope of harm my father inflicted, not just against the crown's interests, but against a specific person he decided, before she was even born, was worth sacrificing for my benefit. I will not stand as a shield for that cruelty any longer. The council's judgment, when it finally came, stripped Lorcan of every remaining privilege, extending his exile with formal permanent banishment from the kingdom's borders, alongside restitution ordered directly to Fenry. A settlement that felt, she thought privately, considerably less important than simply having the truth finally publicly acknowledged. That evening, exhausted from the trial's emotional weight, she found Draven waiting in the garden, moonlight silvering the fountain's steady trickle in a scene that felt, suddenly, achingly similar to the night everything had first changed. "It's over," she said, settling beside him on their usual bench. "The trial is," Draven agreed, taking her hand gently. "The healing, I imagine, takes considerably longer." "Probably," Fenry admitted. "But I think, for the first time in 3 years, I actually believe I'll get there eventually." Draven turned to face her fully, softness and deep certainty in his golden eyes. "I know this has been an unimaginably difficult few months," he said. "Discovering the depth of what was taken from you, testifying before the entire council, relearning everything you thought you understood about your own worth. I don't want to rush anything you're not ready for, but I find myself, more each day, absolutely certain of what I want, entirely independent of any bond or prophecy or old magic." He paused, vulnerability crossing his composed features. "I want to build something real with you, Fenry. Slowly, if that's what you need, but genuinely, and entirely by my own choice." Fenry felt warmth spread through her chest, steady and certain in a way that had nothing to do with fate deciding anything on her behalf. "I want that too," she said softly. "I think I've wanted it since the moment your wolf refused to look anywhere else in that hall, even before I understood what it meant." Draven smiled, the expression transforming his usually composed features into something younger, more open, more genuinely happy than she'd seen from him even in their quietest private moments. "Then perhaps," he said, "we've both been exactly where we needed to be, however strange the path that brought us here." Above them, moonlight continued spilling silver across the garden, and Fenry, sitting beside a king who'd chosen her, genuinely, deliberately chosen her, free of any manipulation or ancient prophecy, felt something in her chest finally, fully settle into place. 3 years of quiet grief slowly giving way to something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, remarkably, unmistakably like hope. 6 months after the choosing ceremony, Fenry stood in front of a full-length mirror in her own chambers. Chambers that had, gradually and without much formal declaration, become simply her chambers rather than a temporary guest suite, and tried to reconcile the woman staring back at her with the girl who'd once made herself as small as possible in the corner of every room. "You look terrified," Marybeth observed from the doorway, arms crossed, her expression carrying the particular fondness she'd developed over months of watching Fenry slowly, cautiously, step into a life she'd never imagined for herself. "I am terrified," Fenry admitted, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the deep blue gown Draven had commissioned for tonight's occasion. The formal announcement of their courtship to the full kingdom. 6 months of careful, deliberate relationship building, finally ready to be acknowledged publicly. What if everyone still sees me the way they used to? The rejected Omega? Unworthy? Waiting to be humiliated all over again? Then they'll be wrong, Mary Beth said simply. As they were wrong before. The only difference now is you know it, rather than simply hoping it might be true. Fenry managed a small, unsteady smile. When did you get so wise? I've always been this wise. You've simply finally started listening. Mary Beth crossed the room, taking both of Fenry's hands in her weathered ones. I watched you disappear into corners for 3 years, child. Tonight, I intend to watch you walk into a room and take up exactly as much space as you deserve, which, for the record, is considerable. The Great Hall, when Fenry finally entered it that evening, looked nothing like the chaotic wreckage of the choosing ceremony 6 months prior. Golden light filled the space instead of silver moonlight, warm and celebratory rather than tense with ancient ritual, and the crowd that turned to watch her enter carried none of the calculating scrutiny she remembered from before. Only genuine, curious warmth. 6 months of the kingdom slowly learning the true story behind that catastrophic night having transformed public opinion considerably. Draven waited at the center of the hall, and the moment their eyes met across the crowded room, Fenry felt none of the old instinct to shrink away, to disappear into whatever shadow might hide her from attention. Instead, steadiness settled into her chest as she crossed the hall toward him, chin lifted not out of practiced defiance but genuine confidence. You look extraordinary, Draven murmured, once she'd reached him, his golden eyes warm with open admiration. You look nervous, she countered, noting the slight tension in his shoulders despite his composed expression. I am nervous, he admitted. 6 months of careful private courtship, and tonight I finally get to simply be with you, in front of everyone, without worrying what conclusions they might draw. Let them draw whatever conclusions they like, Fenry said, surprising herself with the ease of the words. I've spent enough years worrying what other people thought of me. I find I'm considerably more interested in what I think of us. Draven's expression softened further, love visible beneath the careful composure he still occasionally wore like armor from years of political necessity. And what do you think, Fenry Duskthorn? I think, she said softly, that I'd very much like to spend the rest of my life finding out what comes next, alongside a king who chose me, genuinely, deliberately chose me, rather than simply having his wolf decide for him. The formal announcement that followed passed in a blur of ceremony and celebration, considerably warmer than the ritual 6 months before, and Fenry found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely enjoying the attention rather than fearing it. Dancing with Draven beneath golden lantern light, laughing freely with Mary Beth and several courtiers who'd become, gradually, genuine friends rather than distant strangers, even exchanging a brief, surprisingly warm conversation with Sylvain, who had remained at court in a considerably diminished but earnestly reformed capacity, working closely with the council's new Omega representation initiatives. It was near midnight, the celebration finally beginning to wind down, when Draven led her out to the same garden where so much of their careful courtship had unfolded, moonlight silvering the fountain exactly as it had that very first difficult night. I have something to ask you, he said, and something in his voice made Fenry's heart begin to race, though not with the old, familiar fear. You're doing that nervous thing again. I'm allowed to be nervous. This is considerably more significant than a formal courtship announcement. He reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box that made Fenry's breath catch entirely. Fenry Duskthorn. 6 months ago, my wolf recognized something my conscious mind hadn't yet learned to see, that you were, and are, exactly what I needed, entirely independent of any prophecy or scheme or ancient magic that brought us to that moment. I've spent every day since falling in love with you deliberately, by choice, discovering new reasons every single day why that recognition was correct. He knelt, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, moonlight catching against its modest stone. I love you. Not because fate decided it, but because I've genuinely, thoroughly chosen it every single day since we met. Will you marry me? Fenry felt tears rise, warm and overwhelming. 3 years of believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of devotion finally, completely dissolving beneath the weight of a love she'd chosen to believe in, slowly and carefully, over 6 months of genuine partnership. Yes, she said, voice thick with emotion. Yes, absolutely yes. Draven rose, sliding the ring onto her trembling finger before pulling her into an embrace that felt, Fenry thought, like everything she'd once believed impossible finally settling into place. Not because destiny demanded it, but because 2 people had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to build something real together. I love you, she whispered against his shoulder. I don't think I properly understood what those words meant until I met you. Not fate, not obligation, just genuine, chosen love. I love you too, Draven said, pulling back just enough to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. Entirely, deliberately, and for the rest of whatever life we choose to build together. Behind them, the garden fountain continued its steady, moonlit trickle, bearing silent witness to a proposal built not on ancient prophecy or manufactured circumstance, but on 6 months of careful, genuine choice. 2 people who'd found their way to each other, despite manipulation designed specifically to keep them apart, and who now stood ready to build a future entirely, deliberately their own. The wedding planning consumed the following months with a whirlwind of fabric samples, seating charts, and increasingly elaborate opinions from every corner of the kingdom. But it was a quiet morning nearly 3 months after the proposal that brought the first genuine threat to their newfound happiness. There's been an incident at the border, Draven said, finding Fenry in the library where she'd taken to spending her mornings, now formally installed as an advisor to the Council's Omega Representation Committee. His expression carried a tightness she'd learned to recognize as genuine concern rather than ordinary political frustration. What kind of incident? Lorcan, Draven said grimly. He's been spotted near the Northern Territories, apparently attempting to rally support among packs sympathetic to his exile, claiming the Council's judgment against him was unjust, that he acted only out of love for his daughter and loyalty to the Crown's future stability. Fenry felt old fear stir in her stomach, quickly followed by firmer resolve. Do people believe him? Some, Draven admitted. Enough to be concerning. There are still pockets of the kingdom that valued the old hierarchies Lorcan represented. Packs uncomfortable with the reforms we've been implementing regarding Omega representation. Uncomfortable with a king who chose an undervalued Omega over a traditionally suitable political match. He rubbed his temple, exhaustion evident beneath his composed exterior. I don't believe he poses any genuine threat to the throne itself, but I worry what he might attempt regarding you, specifically, given how thoroughly his plans were unraveled by your survival and your growing influence. You think he'd try to hurt me? I think, Draven said carefully, a man who spent 15 years constructing an elaborate scheme around controlling your narrative isn't likely to simply accept that scheme's complete collapse without some final attempt at reclaiming control. Fenry absorbed this, old instinct to shrink away warring against months of learning, deliberately and carefully, how to stand her ground instead. Then we prepare for it, she said finally. I'm not going back to hiding, Draven. Not for him, not for anyone. Pride crossed Draven's face. I wouldn't ask you to. I simply want you protected while we address it. The attempt, when it finally came, arrived not through violence, but through something considerably more insidious. A forged letter, apparently written in Fenry's own hand, circulated among several border packs, claiming she'd been coerced into her position at court, that her bond with Draven had been manufactured through dark magic rather than genuine recognition, and that she desperately sought rescue from a kingdom that had trapped her against her will. "This is absurd," Fenry said, staring at the forged document Mary Beth had brought to her attention, fury replacing the initial jolt of fear. "My handwriting doesn't even look like this." "It's close enough to fool someone who's never seen your actual correspondence," Mary Beth said grimly. "And Lorcan knows precisely which packs are least likely to verify the claim directly before acting on it." "Acting on it how?" The answer arrived within days, in the form of an armed delegation from one of the northern border packs, arriving at the castle gates demanding Fenry's immediate release from what they'd been convinced was magical coercion, prepared, if necessary, to forcibly remove her for her own protection. The confrontation that followed, in the castle's main courtyard, carried a tension Fenry hadn't felt since that first chaotic night of the choosing ceremony, armed pack members facing down royal guards, accusations flying, the entire situation teetering dangerously close to genuine violence. "Enough," Fenry said finally, stepping forward before Draven could intervene further, her voice carrying clearly across the tense courtyard. "I understand you've been told I'm here against my will. I understand that concern, genuinely. But I'm asking you to listen to me directly, rather than a forged letter designed specifically to manipulate exactly this kind of protective instinct." The pack's lead representative, a weathered older woman with suspicious eyes, studied her carefully. "Prove it then. Prove you're here willingly." "I don't know how to prove a feeling," Fenry said honestly. "I can tell you that I fell in love with this man slowly, deliberately, over months of careful courtship, entirely free to leave at any point had I chosen to. I can tell you that the person who forged that letter spent 15 years manipulating my entire life before this, ensuring my rejection, my isolation, my belief that I was worthless, all so his own daughter could claim a throne meant to be earned rather than engineered." Her voice grew stronger with each word, old fear giving way entirely to fierce conviction. "I understand wanting to protect someone you believe is in danger. I lived isolated and dismissed for 3 years, genuinely believing myself unworthy of care. I recognize protective instinct when I see it. But I'm asking you to extend that same protective instinct toward believing me now, rather than a stranger's forged claim." Silence settled over the courtyard, the pack representative studying her with visibly shifting uncertainty. It was Draven who spoke next, stepping forward carefully. "I won't ask you to simply trust my word," he said, "but I will offer this. Speak with her privately, without guards, without my presence at all. Ask her anything you need to. If, after that conversation, you still believe she requires rescue, I will personally ensure safe passage for her departure. No conditions attached." The offer visibly surprised the pack representative, suspicion warring with reluctant respect. "You'd risk that? Simply to prove a point?" "I'd risk considerably more than that," Draven said quietly, "to ensure Fenry's genuine well-being is never once in question, even at the cost of my own comfort." The private conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, and when Fenry finally emerged from it, the pack representative's earlier suspicion had transformed entirely into embarrassment. "I owe you an apology," the woman said, bowing slightly. "And I imagine, considerably more urgently, we owe the Crown information regarding whoever provided that forged letter." "Lorcan Ravensworth," Fenry said, "currently attempting to rebuild influence from exile, using exactly this kind of manipulation to destabilize what he can no longer control directly." The pack representative's expression darkened considerably. Then perhaps it's time several northern packs reconsidered any lingering sympathy toward a man willing to endanger innocent people simply to salvage his own ambitions. The formal capture of Lorcan Ravensworth, attempting to flee north toward less regulated territories once word of his failed manipulation reached him, took place 3 weeks later, ending, finally and completely, any remaining threat he posed to the kingdom's stability or to Fenry's own safety. "It's over," Draven said, finding her in the garden that evening. The same garden where so much of their story had unfolded. Fully this time. Permanent imprisonment, formally sentenced by the full council. No possibility of exile or further influence. Fenry let out a long, unsteady breath, months of underlying tension finally beginning to release from her shoulders. "I keep waiting to feel completely safe," she admitted. "Like some part of me still expects another scheme, another manipulation, waiting just around the corner." "That's understandable," Draven said gently, settling beside her. "You spent years believing your safety could be taken from you without warning. That kind of fear doesn't simply vanish because the immediate threat is resolved. How do I stop waiting for it?" "Perhaps you don't entirely," Draven said thoughtfully. "Perhaps you simply build a life solid enough that even lingering fear doesn't shake its foundation. A life full of people who've proven repeatedly that they'll stand beside you rather than against you." Fenry leaned into his shoulder, watching moonlight ripple across the familiar fountain, and felt steadiness settle deep in her chest. Not the absence of all fear, perhaps, but something more resilient than fear alone could shake. "I think," she said softly, "I'd like to start that life properly, soon." Draven smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair. "The wedding's in 6 weeks, if I recall correctly." 6 weeks, Fenry agreed, certainty settling over the words. "Sounds exactly right." The 6 weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations, though Fenry found herself, more and more, carving out quiet moments amid the chaos to simply breathe and remember how far she'd come from the girl who once made herself invisible in corners. "You're smiling at nothing again," Sylvain observed, looking up from the seating chart they'd been arguing over for the better part of an hour. Their friendship, unlikely as it had once seemed, had grown steadily over the months. Two women who'd both been shaped by Lorcan's manipulation finding in each other, an understanding neither could quite find elsewhere. "I'm allowed to smile at nothing," Fenry said, though she couldn't quite suppress the grin. "I'm getting married in 9 days. 8, Sylvain corrected. "Not that anyone's counting." "You're counting. I'm the acting coordinator for half these arrangements. Of course I'm counting." Sylvain set down her quill, studying Fenry with an expression that had grown considerably warmer over the months since the trial. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it's you. Truly. I spent so long believing I wanted this life, this throne, and I understand now I never actually wanted any of it for the right reasons. Watching you build something real, something chosen rather than engineered, it's given me hope that I might find something similarly genuine eventually, for myself." Fenry reached across the table, squeezing Sylvain's hand briefly. "You will. You're not your father's plans anymore. You get to decide what you actually want now." "Terrifying thought," Sylvain admitted, though a genuine smile accompanied the words. "But yes, I'm working on it." The seating chart negotiations were interrupted by Mary Beth's arrival, carrying an expression that immediately set Fenry's instincts on alert. "There's someone here to see you," the old healer said. "Says he knew your mother." Fenry's breath caught. Her mother had died when she was young. Memories faded to little more than warmth and a half-remembered lullaby, and the mention of anyone claiming that connection sent an unexpected jolt through her chest. The man waiting in the small receiving room was elderly, weathered by years of outdoor work, with kind eyes that studied her carefully as she entered. "You have her eyes," he said, before any formal introduction. "I'd know them anywhere." "You knew my mother?" "I did. Serwyn Duskthorn. We grew up in the same village, before she married your father and moved north." He hesitated. "I heard about the wedding, about everything that happened these past months. I thought you should know something about her before you take this next step." Fenry sat, heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and apprehension. "What is it?" "Your mother," the old man said gently, "was rejected too, long before you were born. A young alpha, decades ago, claimed her bond was weak. Much the same accusation later leveled against you. She spent years believing something was wrong with her, exactly as you did." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "I always wondered if it ran in certain bloodlines, bonds that present differently, quietly, deeply, easily mistaken for weakness by those who don't understand what they're witnessing. The same words Corvinus used about you, if the rumors from court are accurate." Fenry felt the room tilt slightly, generations of quiet suffering suddenly connecting into a pattern she'd never had reason to suspect. "You think my mother's bond was rejected the same way mine was? Genuinely rejected, not manipulated?" "I believe so, yes. Simple misunderstanding, rather than deliberate scheme in her case. But the pain was identical, I imagine. She carried that rejection her whole life, even after finding happiness with your father eventually." His weathered face softened further. "She would be so proud of you, child, not simply for finding your own bond, but for refusing to let that old family pattern of quiet suffering write your ending the way it wrote hers." Fenry felt tears rise, grief for a mother she barely remembered tangling with fierce protective pride. "Thank you for telling me this. Truly." "I thought you deserved to know," the old man said, rising slowly. "Your mother's story doesn't have to be a warning, child. Let it be a comfort instead. Proof that even generations of quiet rejection can end, eventually, in genuine happiness. You're simply the one who finally broke that particular pattern." That evening, Fenry found Draven in his study, poring over final wedding logistics with the same intense focus he brought to every council matter, and watching him work, quietly dedicated even to details as small as flower arrangements, made her chest ache with tenderness. "I learned something today," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "about my mother." She recounted the old man's visit, watching Draven's expression shift from curiosity to gentle understanding as the story unfolded. "That explains something I've wondered about," he said once she'd finished. "Why the bond between us felt different somehow, even before we understood what was happening. Deeper, quieter, easier to overlook if you weren't paying careful attention." He reached across the desk, taking her hand. "I'm sorry you carry that inherited history. But I'm also, selfishly, rather grateful it exists. It's part of what makes you who you are." "I keep thinking about her," Fenry admitted, wondering if she ever found peace with what happened to her before she found my father. "I imagine she found considerable peace eventually," Draven said gently. "And I imagine, watching you now, she'd be immeasurably proud that her daughter refused to let that same pattern define an entire lifetime." Fenry felt fresh tears prick at her eyes, though these carried more warmth than grief. "I wish she could be here. For the wedding, I mean." "Perhaps she is in her own way," Draven said softly. "In whatever part of you refused to stay small, refused to believe the lies constructed around your worth, refused to give up even when every circumstance suggested you should. That resilience came from somewhere, Fenry. Perhaps it came from her." They sat together in comfortable silence, Draven's study warm with candlelight, and Fenry allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel grateful for the mother she barely remembered, for the man across the desk who'd chosen her deliberately and repeatedly, for the strange, difficult path that had led her, against every engineered obstacle, to exactly this moment. 8 days, she said finally, echoing Sylvain's earlier count. 8 days, Draven agreed, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. And then, finally, the rest of our lives, entirely our own to build. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, autumn sunlight gilding the castle grounds in warm gold, and Fenry stood once more before her mirror, though this time the woman staring back felt entirely, unmistakably like herself. "No nerves today?" Mary Beth asked, fastening the final clasp on Fenry's gown, simpler than court fashion typically demanded, ivory silk unadorned by the elaborate jewels most royal brides favored, chosen deliberately because it felt like her rather than like a performance of what a queen should look like. "Different kind of nerves," Fenry said, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. "Not the kind that makes me want to disappear. The kind that makes me feel like my heart might actually burst from how full it is." "That's the good kind," Mary Beth said, brightness in her own eyes. "I've waited a long time to see you wear that particular kind of nervous, child." A knock interrupted them, and Sylvain swept in without waiting for an answer, arms laden with what appeared to be an entirely unnecessary quantity of hairpins. "I come bearing reinforcements," she announced, "in case the wind decides today is the perfect day to undo 3 hours of careful styling." "You look like you're preparing for a siege," Fenry observed, eyeing the small arsenal. "I am preparing for a siege, against wind, against nerves, and against Elder Wickery, who has already asked me 4 separate times whether the ceremony will include proper northern vows or that soft southern nonsense, by which I believe he means anything with actual romance in it." "He asked me the same thing yesterday," Mary Beth said dryly. "I told him the ceremony would include exactly the vows the bride and groom chose, and that if he had further opinions, he was welcome to write them down and eat them." Fenry laughed, the sound loose and easy in a way that still, occasionally, surprised her. "You didn't actually say that." "I absolutely did," he laughed, mostly. Sylvain set down her hairpins and studied Fenry for a long moment, softness crossing her expression. "I keep thinking about that first ceremony," she admitted. "How different this feels. I was so certain that night that I understood exactly what my life was supposed to look like. Watching you get ready today, actually ready, not performing readiness. It's like watching 2 entirely different worlds." "They are 2 entirely different worlds," Fenry said gently. "One built on manipulation, one built on choice. I'm grateful every day we both got the chance to leave the first one behind." "As am I," Sylvain said, and busied herself immediately with adjusting a hairpin that did not need adjusting, clearly unwilling to let the moment tip fully into tears before the ceremony had even begun. The ceremony itself took place not in the great hall where the catastrophic choosing had unfolded months before, but in the castle gardens, beneath an archway of late-blooming flowers, close enough to the fountain that its steady trickle provided a soft, familiar accompaniment to the vows exchanged there. Fenry walked toward Draven without a single hesitant step, chin lifted not from practiced defiance, but from genuine confidence, and when their eyes met beneath the flower-draped archway, she felt none of the old instinct toward invisibility, only the steady certainty of a woman walking exactly toward where she belonged. Draven, for his part, looked considerably less composed than his usual careful, controlled self, jaw tight with obvious emotion, eyes bright, and when she finally reached him, he let out a small, startled laugh, as though he hadn't quite believed the morning would actually arrive until the exact moment it did. "You're staring," Fenry murmured, once she'd reached him. "I intend to keep staring for the rest of my life, if that's acceptable to you." "Extremely acceptable." "I once believed," Draven said, during his vows, voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd of friends, reformed former rivals, and a kingdom slowly learning to value voices it had once dismissed, that duty and desire existed as separate things, that a king's heart mattered less than a king's obligations. You taught me otherwise, Fenry. You taught me that choosing someone deliberately, repeatedly, freely, creates something considerably stronger than any bond fate might simply hand us without our consent. I choose you. Not because my wolf recognized you first, but because every single day since, my heart has confirmed that recognition entirely on its own. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the crowd when, at the back, someone's very small child loudly asked whether the king was going to turn into a wolf again, and Draven, without missing a beat, glanced toward the sound and said, "Not today, I promise," which earned him an even louder ripple of laughter and a visible, relieved grin from the child's mother. Fenry felt tears spill freely as she spoke her own vows. 3 years of quiet grief finally, completely transformed into something whole. "I spent years believing myself unworthy of being chosen," she said. "Unworthy of taking up space, of being seen, of mattering to anyone at all. You didn't just choose me, Draven. You taught me how to choose myself again, how to believe I deserved exactly the space I was finally brave enough to take up. I love you entirely and deliberately, for every single day we've built together and every day still ahead of us." When Draven finally, gently lifted her veil to kiss her, the crowd's cheering felt to Fenry like the exact opposite of that catastrophic night months before. No longer chaos and confusion, but genuine, unrestrained joy. An entire kingdom celebrating not fate's decision, but two people's deliberate, hard-won choice of each other. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, golden lanterns replacing the earlier sunlight as dusk settled over the castle grounds, and Fenry found herself, over the course of several hours, dragged into dancing by nearly every person she'd come to care about over the past year. Marybeth first, moving with surprising energy for a woman of her age and grumbling the entire time about her joints. Then Elder Wickery, who turned out, to everyone's astonishment, to be a genuinely graceful dancer, though he refused to explain where he'd learned. And finally, breathless and laughing, back into Draven's arms as the music slowed. It was during a quiet moment, slipping away from the festivities to catch her breath, that Fenry found herself unexpectedly approached by Sylvain, radiant in deep burgundy, holding 2 glasses of wine. "I brought you this," Sylvain said, offering 1 glass, "and I wanted a moment before the night got away from us entirely." "You look happy," Fenry observed, accepting the wine. "I am, actually. Watching you today." Sylvain paused, thoughtfulness crossing her face. "I received a letter this week from a border pack leader interested in discussing potential alliance opportunities. Nothing romantic, simply professional correspondence, but it made me realize how much I've grown these past months into someone who gets excited about genuine opportunity rather than engineered destiny." "I'm proud of you," Fenry said sincerely. "Truly." "I'm proud of both of us," Sylvain said, raising her glass slightly. "To choosing our own paths, however long it took us to find them." They toasted quietly, 2 women once positioned as rivals by someone else's careful manipulation, now standing together as something closer to genuine friends. And Fenry felt, watching Sylvain walk back toward the celebration, quiet satisfaction at how thoroughly both their stories had outgrown the narrow roles Lorcan had once assigned them. Draven found her shortly after, offering his hand with a warm smile. "Dance with me, Your Majesty?" Fenry laughed at the title, still unfamiliar despite months of preparation. "I don't think I'll ever get entirely used to that." "You have plenty of time to grow into it," Draven said, pulling her close as music drifted across the garden. "A lifetime, in fact." "Speaking of which," Fenry said, resting her head against his shoulder as they swayed slowly, "Marybeth informed me earlier that she fully intends to move into the castle permanently, on the grounds that, and I quote, 'Someone competent needs to be nearby when you two inevitably do something ridiculous.' She's not wrong to worry. She absolutely is wrong. We're extremely responsible people. You once let Elder Wickery believe for an entire afternoon that the castle fountain was cursed, simply because you didn't want to explain why you'd been crying beside it. That was one time, and it was a very effective distraction." Draven laughed, the sound warm against her hair, and they danced beneath the same stars that had witnessed his proposal months before, beneath the same moon that had once, chaotically, and unexpectedly, revealed a truth 15 years of careful manipulation had tried desperately to bury. "Happy?" Draven murmured eventually. "Immeasurably," Fenry said, and meant it entirely. 3 years of quiet grief finally, fully replaced by a joy she'd once believed impossible for someone like her to claim. 2 years after the wedding, Fenry stood in the same garden where she'd exchanged vows, watching autumn light filter gold through branches heavier now with the particular richness that comes from time and tending, and found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed from the invisible, careful existence she'd once resigned herself to. "You're doing the thing again," Draven said, joining her by the fountain, "where you get lost in thought and forget the rest of us exist." "I'm allowed occasional lapses," Fenry said, leaning into his side. "I was thinking about how different everything looks now." The kingdom had changed considerably over those 2 years. The council's Omega Representation Initiative, which Fenry now formally chaired, had expanded to include representatives from every pack territory, ensuring voices once dismissed and undervalued now carried genuine weight in governance decisions. Sylvain had found her own path entirely, currently serving as a trade liaison between territories, genuinely respected for skills she'd once believed were engineered rather than earned. Even Bartran Wickery, the elder who'd traveled from Fenry's home pack, had become an occasional advisor on matters of pack tradition, helping bridge old customs with the reforms slowly reshaping how Omegas were valued across the realm. Though he still, to Fenry's ongoing amusement, referred to the reforms as that soft southern nonsense, at least once per visit, entirely without malice. "How is Corvinus settling into his new role?" Fenry asked, watching a group of young pups chase each other across the garden's far edge, children of court staff, welcomed now to play freely in spaces once reserved strictly for nobility. "Remarkably well, for a man who spent 20 years in seclusion," Draven said, amusement evident in his voice. "Though I suspect being formally recognized as the Crown's chief advisor on prophecy and bond magic suits him considerably better than hiding from the consequences of a vision he never intended to be weaponized. He's taken to giving lectures now, apparently. I attended one last month. Considerably more entertaining than I expected, given the subject matter." "He deserves that recognition," Fenry said. He could have stayed silent that night, let Lorcan's scheme play out entirely, protected himself from the complications of speaking up. He chose truth instead, even knowing what it might cost him. "As did you," Draven said quietly, choosing to forgive Sylvain, choosing generosity over bitterness at every turn, choosing to build something better from circumstances that could easily have hardened you instead. Fenry considered this, watching sunlight ripple across the fountain's surface. "I think I learned that from you, actually. Watching you dismantle 15 years of careful manipulation, piece by piece, without ever losing sight of who you genuinely wanted to become, rather than who Lorcan's influence had shaped you toward being." "We taught each other, I think," Draven said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "That seems rather fitting, for two people who found their way to each other despite every obstacle specifically designed to keep us apart." They sat together a while longer, watching the pups tumble over each other in the golden afternoon light, and Fenry found her thoughts drifting, unbidden, toward a conversation she'd been quietly preparing herself to have for several weeks now. The formal announcement, made later that same evening during a quiet family dinner with Mary Beth and Sylvain, brought tears to every eye at the table. "I'm pregnant," Fenry said, watching joy bloom across Draven's face in real time, watching Mary Beth's composed exterior crack entirely into delighted tears, watching Sylvain's genuine happiness for a friend who'd become, over 2 years, something like chosen family. "You're certain?" Draven asked, voice thick with emotion, already reaching for her hands across the table. "Quite certain. Mary Beth confirmed it this morning." "I did," Mary Beth confirmed, wiping at her eyes with characteristic gruffness, even amid obvious joy. "Though I confess, I'm rather looking forward to spoiling this child considerably more than I ever admitted to spoiling its mother." "You spoiled me plenty," Fenry laughed. "You simply disguised it as practical wisdom. There is no version of me sneaking you extra bread rolls during your worst weeks that qualifies as practical wisdom, child. That was spoiling, plain and simple, and I regret nothing." Sylvain, dabbing carefully at her own eyes to avoid smudging her makeup, raised her glass. "To the newest member of a family built entirely on choice," she said. "May they inherit their mother's stubbornness and their father's ability to occasionally admit when he's wrong." "I do that frequently," Draven protested. "You do it eventually," Sylvain corrected. "Frequently implies less arguing beforehand." The months that followed brought their own particular joys and challenges. Draven's occasionally overprotective hovering, which Fenry found equal parts endearing and exasperating. Particularly the week he insisted on personally taste-testing every meal brought to her chambers for safety, until Mary Beth threatened to bar him from the kitchens entirely. Mary Beth's increasingly detailed opinions on proper prenatal care, delivered with the absolute authority of a woman who had, by her own count, delivered more babies than you've had hot dinners, Your Majesty, so kindly sit down and let me work. And Sylvain's enthusiastic, if occasionally overwhelming, planning for a nursery that grew more elaborate with each passing week, until Fenry finally had to gently request slightly fewer than the 11 different color schemes currently under consideration. It was during a particularly difficult evening, 7 months into the pregnancy, exhausted and uncomfortable in ways she hadn't anticipated, that Fenry found herself unexpectedly emotional, old fears resurfacing despite 2 years of steady healing. "What if I'm not enough?" she asked Draven quietly, curled against his side as evening settled over their private chambers. "What if this child inherits that same vulnerability my mother and I both carried, bonds that present quietly, easily dismissed by people who don't understand what they're witnessing? What if I can't protect them from the same rejection I experienced?" Draven pulled her closer, understanding immediately the depth of fear beneath the question. "Then we protect them together," he said firmly. "We've already begun building a kingdom that values exactly the kind of quiet strength you once believed made you unworthy. Our child won't grow up in the world you did, Fenry. They'll grow up in the world we've been building deliberately, specifically, to ensure no child ever again mistakes their own quiet depth for weakness. You can't promise the world will be entirely fair," Fenry said softly, "even with all our reforms." "No," Draven agreed, "but I can promise our child will never once doubt they're loved exactly as they are, regardless of what the wider world might occasionally get wrong. That's considerably more than either of us had growing up, and I think it matters more than we sometimes realize." Fenry felt some of her anxiety ease, replaced by quiet gratitude for a partnership built genuinely, deliberately, on exactly this kind of steady reassurance. "I love you," she said simply. "I don't think I properly understood before you how much genuine partnership could heal even the oldest wounds." "I love you too," Draven said, resting a gentle hand against her rounded stomach. "Entirely, deliberately, for the rest of our lives. And now for this new life we're building together as well." Epilogue. 3 years later, Fenry stood once more in the castle gardens, watching her daughter, dark-haired and golden-eyed, unmistakably her father's child in coloring but carrying her mother's same quiet, watchful thoughtfulness, carefully examine a fallen leaf with the intense concentration only very young children seem capable of. "Mama, look," the girl said, holding up the leaf triumphantly. "It has spots like stars." "It does," Fenry agreed, crouching down to admire the discovery properly. "You have very sharp eyes, little one." Nearby, Draven watched the exchange with open tenderness, and Fenry felt, as she often did these days, quiet gratitude wash over her at how completely her life had transformed from those early years of careful invisibility. The kingdom, too, had transformed considerably. Omega representation now formalized permanently within council structure. Quiet bonds no longer dismissed as weakness but recognized, thanks largely to Corvinus's ongoing scholarly work, as simply a different, equally valid expression of connection. Sylvain had recently announced her own engagement to a trade partner from the Eastern Territories who valued her genuinely, entirely free of any manufactured circumstance. Even Bartran Wickery's home pack had elected its first Omega representative to local leadership, a small but meaningful ripple of the larger changes Fenry had helped set in motion. "You're thinking again," Draven said, settling beside her as their daughter continued her careful leaf collection nearby. "Just grateful," Fenry said, leaning into him. "For all of it, even the difficult parts, strange as that sounds." "Not strange at all," Draven said gently. "The difficult parts taught us both exactly how much we were capable of building, once given the genuine chance to choose it." Their daughter looked up then, catching them watching her, and offered a bright, unself-conscious smile entirely free of any doubt about her own worth or place in the world. A smile Fenry recognized, with quiet, overwhelming joy, as the exact opposite of the careful invisibility she herself had once believed was all she deserved. "Papa," the little girl announced, marching over with the leaf still clutched proudly in one small fist. "I've decided this leaf will live in my room forever." "An excellent decision," Draven said gravely, as though she'd announced a matter of considerable state importance. "Should we build it a small throne?" "Yes," the girl said, entirely serious. "A very small one." Fenry laughed, pulling her daughter into a gentle hug, breathing in the particular warmth of a family built deliberately, entirely by choice. Above them, autumn sunlight continued spilling warm and golden across a garden that had witnessed rejection and revelation, catastrophe and courtship, proposal and wedding vows. And now, finally, simply the quiet, ordinary happiness of a life built exactly as it was always meant to be.